We've had 5 Prime Ministers in 5 years, and that is the revolving door Prime Ministership.
There is no leadership. We don't trust any of them. We're sick of them all.
The politicians have just got pretty gutless all round.
Australians have never been so distrusting of politicians. But there was a time when things were different.
You'd be out of your cotton-picking mind if you didn't vote Labor. In 23 years they had the opportunity to stop the take of the middleman. You tell me one thing that they did.
Ladies and gentlemen, Bob Hawke.
Bob was always a leader. A leader.
He had a sense of destiny.
Self-belief. Utter self-belief.
His government produced modern Australia.
Bob Hawke was one of them, but he was also one of us.
How's that? Any boss who sacks anyone for not turning up today is a bum.
I think people like to see the politician who's got a bit of character, a bit of individuality and above all, a bit of humour.
I have my moments.
Now, Australian women liked him very much.
A Bob Hawke today, behaving in the same manner, would never become Prime Minister. He did some appalling things. Shocking, just plain bloody shocking.
Here's looking at you, kid.
We want flawed characters as our leaders that may have made some mistakes in the past, but they've learned from those mistakes.
You don't cease to be a husband. You don't cease to be a father.
So what made this flawed man a leader we'd never forget?
Leadership does consist of leading, of not saying, oh, what do the public think?
I regard Bob Hawke as the best Labor Prime Minister this country's had.
What is the future?
It's big.
Election night, March 1983. Prime Minister Malcolm Fraser has rushed the nation to the polls, hoping to catch the opposition off guard. But Labor has just changed leaders, and Fraser is facing the most popular man in the country.
After one of the shortest, sharpest election campaigns in recent memory, the focus of attention has finally shifted here.
The buzz of excitement was everywhere, given that this looked like it was going to be an historic change of government.
To very loud applause from the huge number of people who've been crammed into this very hot tally room.
There was this huge groundswell of excitement. Bob Hawke and his wife Hazel were actually going to come into the tally room. I think Bob was looking for a crowd that night. And suddenly the door opened. This guy with the silver hair poked his head through, then brought in his lovely wife, all dressed in silver, and something around that was quite magical. It was a bit like the Second Coming. It was amazing.
Mr. Hawke is now standing up on a scaffold, looking down at the crowd, which is down below here.
Like every other person who's got to the top, Bob Hawke had his share of luck, but luck alone is not enough.
After a month as leader of the Labor Party, Bob Hawke was close to fulfilling a life's ambition to lead the nation.
To many people, it might appear Bob Hawke just came out of nowhere in 1983, but what we need to remember is that he'd served effectively a 25-year apprenticeship.
Tonight's On Monday conference, facing up to the unions, our special guest, Bob Hawke.
Bob had been a regular fixture on our TV screens for decades as the kingpin of the union movement.
He was. What you see is what you get. He didn't try and be a different person. He didn't have a television persona, like many leaders these days.
Well, look,
Section 55 of the Labor Code of British Columbia.
Oh, British Columbia, that's not Canada.
I beg your pardon?
Oh, you're talking about one province, that's not Canada. Learn your geography and then you might learn your politics. And if you're not careful, you might be included.
Bob was unapologetically Bob, and we loved it.
I have sufficient intelligence, Alan, to understand your question. So let's recognise that we'll continue this miserable-minded interview.
I've got a point I want to make, don't be rude.
Well, don't you be rude to me. Let me finish what I'm saying.
But I can remember very clearly the first impression that he made in my living room watching television. He suddenly exploded onto it.
Let's have the debate now.
Mr. Hawke, I'll make the position quite clear.
Let's have the debate.
You wish to have a debate? I'm not trying to force you into a position.
You will never force me into any position.
This young, abrasive, compelling presence was speaking truth to power in a way that I'd only dreamed of.
Bob was a union man, but he was unlike any union man we'd ever seen before.
In the union movement during the 40s, 50s, 60s, the people who were elected to leadership positions were typically people who'd come from the shop floor. And of course, tertiary education wasn't available to working people. But along comes this anomaly, Bob Hawke, a Rhodes Scholar.
Bob had studied law and then economics in Oxford. He took that training into the trenches with his first job in the unions, fighting for workers' wages. In the 50s and 60s, pay negotiations were a courtroom drama where Bob faced off against the bosses.
A lot of us were overwhelmed by some of the senior counsel, Queen's Counsel that we would see in the courts, and you had to have somebody that was able to match the people that we were up against, representing the employers.
He was very aggressive with the judges, terribly aggressive. They were shocked at his behaviour because he didn't behave like the other learned gentlemen of the bar.
And that's why Bob Hawke was such a significant figure. Everyone's pay increase depended upon Bob's advocacy.
And Bob delivered. In his first wage case, he won workers their highest pay rise in 6 years.
The Commonwealth Conciliation and Arbitration Commission, by majority decision today, increased the federal basic wage by 15 shillings. I established, frankly, an enormous reputation immediately in '59 with my first case, and I was a national figure from then on.
Look, I was a working class kid. We were very poor. To have somebody go down and fighting for you and fighting the pomposity, fighting these people, not giving an inch, and beating them. From that day, Bob was always a leader. Confident, tough, purposeful. And I said, right from that point, you've won me, mate. You've won me. And I was only 16 or 17.
Bob's always had a way of winning over the mob.
He's still got the capability of a beer skull. Good on him.
For years, we've been transfixed by his ability to down a beer. At Oxford University, he'd set a world record by sculling 2.5 pints of beer in 11 seconds.
Bob was the world's #1 drinker. He could drink and drink and drink.
But long before his beer sculling became a rallying cry for the nation, Bob's love of booze helped cement his kinship with the union movement and its blue-collar power brokers.
A lot of the union officials, they could drink. They could really drink. But Bob could outdrink them all. Go to the John Curtin pub. Bob had probably been in there since sometimes before 11:30.
Well, first of all, it was tremendously busy.
It was not just a drinking hole, it was a political decision-making hole.
They say that if diplomats do most of their deals over cocktails, Labor men do theirs over a beer at the Curtin.
Here were these marvellous collection of men, and they were all members of no women officials then. I was a bit sceptical at first when this young academic came down amongst them, but we just clicked, and they were extraordinarily generous to me in sharing their knowledge.
And you would be there till 11 o'clock. And the next morning you'd get up, you'd be the first one there at the ACT Executive. as if he hadn't had a drop to drink. I got to know the Labor movement. I wasn't just representing it. I got to know it and to love it, to be respected by it, and therefore listened to.
By 1969, Bob had won over the workers and the union bosses and was elected head of the union movement, the president of the ACTU.
How long did it take to get out of know?
He was becoming a celebrity, and it would bring dubious accolades.
Well, congratulations. How does it feel to be Father of the Year?
It's an honour. The one who really should have the title is my wife. She has to be father as well as mother most of the time.
And how could Bob be Father of the Year? Well, he spends more time in the pub than he does at home. And look, how could he be Father of the Year?
Well, as his wife, I often think he's doing far too much in terms of the physical running about, speaking that he does.
I drove him home one night to Sandringham, and I walked to his house, and Hazel wasn't very happy. And Hazel said to him, I don't know who the judges are, Bob, giving you Father of the Year. They must be on opium.
The Australian unionist seems to protest more readily than his American or English counterparts. He is more militant.
Bob was dedicated to the workers.
When the union's inspiration through the workers' blood shall run, there can be no power greater anywhere beneath the sun. Yet what on earth is weaker than the feeble strength of one? Oh, fucked it up again, let's start again.
The unions were the lifeblood of the nation, and Bob was a union leader who threw himself at every picket line, fighting for wages, working conditions, even the price of everyday goods.
I believe that this budget is the very negation of democracy.
With every skirmish, his popularity grew.
If there isn't the security of full employment for you, but the whole quality of the life of this country is diminished.
Solidarity forever for the union makes us strong.
Why people liked him. They hated strikes as such, but they went for Bob because he would always negotiate a settlement. And whether it meant going 3 days and 3 nights without stopping, he would do it.
It's 6 o'clock this morning, and the only light in this street is at Bob Hawke's house.
Bob was proving himself a master tactician.
He's leaving for the Latrobe Valley, and one of the touchiest and most difficult assignments of his career. He's going to ask the power workers there to abandon their strike, to back down in effect.
Even if you don't agree with what we're recommending, at least you will do me and those around me this justice of believing in our integrity and that we're only trying to do what we think in the circumstances is in your interest the only possible course of action, whether you agree with us or not.
He'd worked closely with the trade union officials who were running the dispute, kept himself slightly distant until he'd sounded out how it might be fixed. Once he'd sorted that out and he knew that he could get a settlement, he'd move in, the TV cameras would be there, and Bob was able to solve the dispute.
The time has come now where if I shut up and let you have your vote, you'll still have about an hour and a half of important drinking time, I understand, so I won't intrude on that valuable time anymore.
All in favour of the resolution, please show.
What do you want to do? I want to go and have a beer. What about
In those days, half the country belonged to a union, and Bob could now count on the loyalty of working Australia, even on the toughest calls.
He had a wealth of experience, and that's, an experience that's very difficult to replicate today because of the diminished role of trade unions in our society.
By the late 60s, Hawke had a grassroots power base like no other, and they were already backing him for the top job.
I think Bob Hawke
in my personal opinion, will end up Prime Minister.
Well, as far as I'm concerned, I think he's number one.
He will do something for the workers, no doubt about that.
I grew up in the western suburbs of Sydney, and my father was a Labor man, and the first awareness I had as a kid in the 60s of Bob Hawke was my father saying, you know, Hawke will be Prime Minister one day. I think a conversation that took place in many Australian households in the 60s and 70s.
Bob's affinity with the working man had been indoctrinated from a young age. He'd grown up in a staunchly Labor family, and his father was a minister.
My father said to me as a very young bloke, he said, if you believe in the fatherhood of God, you must necessarily believe in the brotherhood of man. I based my life on it.
And Bob's eventual rise to become the nation's leader had always been a prophecy of his mother.
Being a very religious woman, she'd open the Bible daily and it kept on falling open at Isaiah. For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder. Makes me emotional.
Mum says that, you know, when I was born, the Bible had come open at this page where and the government shall be upon his shoulders. And so she had this feeling I was probably destined to do something fairly significant. And I must say that her influence and Dad's influence was absolutely profound.
He had a sense of destiny from childhood, and he was brought up with that ethos. You're here on earth to use your talents and to improve the state of the world.
Hawke had yet to make the prophecy a reality. But even as ACTU president, he'd begun to see himself as a visionary for the nation.
I think it's a day of national tragedy for Australia that we have now compounded our position in the eyes of the world as a racist country.
In 1971, South Africa's all-white rugby team was invited to tour Australia. For Bob, the invitation legitimised South Africa's apartheid regime, which was said to take inspiration from Australia's own White Australia policy.
One of the fundamentals of my character is hatred, an absolute loathing of discrimination in any form.
If the ACTU boycott goes ahead, there's a strong possibility that the moment the plane touches down here, it'll be declared black by every union associated with the ACTU.
Bob's decision to declare a nationwide boycott by union workers would pit him against the government and mainstream conservative Australia.
This is no easy decision, because you know it's going to be unpopular. You know there is no way you can convince the majority of the people that the unions have got a legitimate role to get up and start harassing an international visiting sporting team.
Are you confident this announcement now can stop the South African tour?
Oh, you can't be absolutely confident in these matters, Gary, but my expectation is that it will mean that the South Africans will not be able to tour in Australia.
This is not an industrialist view to go to workers' wages. This goes to something you believe, that you're strongly opposed to apartheid.
It was a brave stand for Bob to take because Australians did overwhelmingly support the right of this racially selected team to come to Australia. I mean, it's horrifying to think now.
I think they should come out here. You're not worried at all about the racism angle? Not at all.
As young fellows who excel at the sport, they've got every right to come to this country. They're invited to Australia, and it's deplorable and execrable that they should be treated the way they have been.
Just having to be a rugby fan, I want to see the football next year. You're not worried about the racist element coming into the football? I want to see them play rugby union here in Australia.
Bob's boycott failed to stop the Springboks from coming, but the tour was marred by street protests and union embargoes.
The bans by the Transport Workers Union are crucial. They refuse to transport the Springboks around Australia, so Billy McMahon, the Prime Minister at the time, offers them the RAAF, which is extraordinary when you think about it.
Well, it's very, very exciting, I've got to tell you, because you're fighting for something you really believe, and you're only 23 or 24. This is heaven. You're fighting for things you believe, and the person you believe in most is leading it.
The fact that the tour has gone on, do you regard that as a personal failure?
No, why should I regard it as a personal failure?
The essence of Bob, self-belief, utter self-belief.
My opinion that they shouldn't have come remains untarnished, untouched.
At the cricket ground in Sydney, over 5,000 trade union and student protesters would turn up to disrupt the match.
I remember going to the Test match in Sydney. I wasn't going to be deterred by campaign. At the time, my view was this is bringing politics into sport, and I still have that view.
People say sport shouldn't be political, and I think that's essentially true, but you can't also think the world operates in splendid isolation. We actually toured South Africa in 1992. Apartheid had just come to an end. You were part of something that was a lot bigger than rugby.
I was a student at Sydney University. A group of us got together and I think we called ourselves the Stop the Tours campaign. When we actually got onto the ground and stopped the game, we didn't know what to do because we hadn't thought we'd get there. So when we got actually into the play, I just sort of laid out in the middle of the ruck and my sister grabbed the ball and kicked it and the Bulletin called it the best kick of the season. It just went right up in the air. And I think we were the only ones that ever did actually stop the game. I got a 2-month jail sentence for it. In the end, it was a huge win for us and I think a huge win for Australia as a nation in that we stopped being seen as the great white brother across the ocean.
Bob would never stop fighting apartheid. As Prime Minister, he would support the campaign to free Nelson Mandela, helping convince the international banks in America and Europe to boycott South African businesses.
And it was marvellous, it worked. He came to Australia to thank me and I think probably the proudest moment of my Prime Ministership, or certainly one of the very proudest.
Back then, Bob was ahead of the pack, but the times were catching up. In the 70s, we were riding a wave of social and political change. After 23 years of Conservative rule, Gough Whitlam was marching Labor to government, promising universal healthcare, education and civil rights reforms.
Fellow citizens, I call on Bob Hawke to address you.
And Bob was right there beside him.
The unsurpassed spokesman and representative of all those in Australia who work for their living as employees.
The unions had always been the industrial muscle behind the Labor Party, but now a union boss had thrust himself to the front of the political stage.
We will once again restore dignity and integrity to Australia's conduct of its international affairs. We will be no one's lackey, and we will once again...
Like there was a sense of excitement that was almost unparalleled in your life, a sense of excitement that here we were with the best two leaders in the political system. They're both on our side, and we were going to win. We're going to win the next election, and the unions were going to do really exciting things for the country.
And win they did. But Labor's two largest personalities were never going to see eye to eye.
Gough was a snob in many ways. I think it always irritated Whitlam that people liked Hawke so much, and he regarded Hawke as a bit of a peasant.
He found it very frustrating to have to deal with Bob. Bob declared himself the second most important person in the country. This was very, very frustrating for a Labor Prime Minister.
The conflicts with Gough and the size of our egos, it's not for me to argue about the latter point. I certainly couldn't deny that we were both pretty well served in that regard. But in a sense, he was his own worst enemy, because you can't, these days, have a Prime Minister who is out of touch with economics.
And the economy would prove Gough's Achilles heel. He flung open the coffers to roll out his reforms. At the same time, Bob's unions broke all records for strike action, demanding their slice of the pie.
I'm indebted to the Labor movement in the state for inviting me here today to open the factory campaign.
We had wages actually rising by 30% and inflation rising by nearly 20%. Now, who caused this? Was it the ACTU?
Bob Hawke, as leader of the union movement, I don't remember him preaching restraint at that time. I certainly don't.
How big a role do you think the trade union movement can play in correcting the faults in Australia's economy at present?
Well, we don't run the enterprises and we don't run the government, so the two main areas of decision-making which affect the level of the health of the economy are decisions made by enterprises and decisions made by government.
I'm sorry to interrupt again, Bob, but on that point, are they the only power brokers in society? Surely today unions are almost as powerful as they are.
They're not as powerful. A lot of the media attempts to create that impression.
Government spending skyrocketed by more than 40%. And as the budget spiralled out of control, the quadrupling of world oil prices sent the global economy into freefall.
The unions, we let Whitlam down. We can blame the international economy, we can do what we like, but it was our own stupidity, our own special form of stupidity. We blow up the wages system, have a wage explosion, we have higher levels of inflation, end up with higher levels of unemployment. Whitlam was right to say to us, and of us, that we didn't deliver our part. We didn't deliver our part. Bob could have done more and should have done more.
But I don't think you can pin that big blowout on the ACTU. They obviously wanted higher wages rather than lower wages. That's the purpose of a trade union. You can pin it instead on the government. The ACTU argues for a very big increase, and the government doesn't contest it. The government reinforces it. Probably the worst single example of economic policy I can think of in our history.
In less than 3 years, Labor had driven the country into recession. But Gough and everyone around him seemed oblivious.
For the past few days, it's mainly been fun in the sun for the delegates attending the vital ALP conference at Terrigal.
I remember well the media coverage at the time, Bob in his swimming trunks and sunning by the side of the pool. But, you know, as part of the wild time of the Whitlam government. But he was also thinking at that time about what was going wrong with the Whitlam government, the economic change that was occurring and how he would tackle it if he got the opportunity.
As the economic crisis deepened, Hawke had a ringside seat as Gough's government imploded. In October 1975, Malcolm Fraser, the Liberal Party's ambitious new leader, refused to pass Gough's budget in the Senate, and instead convinced the Governor-General to sack the Whitlam government.
Well, may we say, God save the Queen. For because nothing will save the Governor-General.
The dismissal polarised the nation.
Been nothing more outrageous done in my political lifetime.
I was shattered like everybody else, and was, one of the first in the streets down in Melbourne City Square, with the megaphone.
As protests erupted around the country, Bob was expected to rally the unions to Gough's defence. Instead, he caught everyone by surprise.
It's been indicated to me, Terry, in the last half hour or so that there are calls for national strikes and people are stopping work here and there and are calling for all these sorts of reactions. Now, I can understand this spontaneous upwelling of feeling, but I want to take the opportunity on your program, as I have on others, to appeal to the trade union movement to stay solid. This is a time for leadership and unity.
What the hell was Bob doing, telling us to calm down? This should have brought the nation to a standstill.
Bob had summoned his loyal union mates. Here, at a moment of national crisis, he privately outlined his own plans.
He said, Bill, he said, what's going to happen is this. Fraser will win the election. They will be in power for 6 years. Fraser has so poisoned himself in terms of what he has done to this country, he can't afford another fight with the unions. He said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to rebuild a sense of confidence and be a man of consensus. And I will be the Prime Minister in 6 years or 7 years.
Men and women of Australia.
Hawke was playing the long game, and his instincts were on the money.
The whole future of Australian democracy is in your hands.
According to the polls, Mr Fraser is poised for a landslide win of the proportions that swept Harold Holt into office in 1966.
No matter how outraged by the dismissal, Australians deserted Gough in droves and voted to put the grown-ups back in charge.
There's one truth in this. The electorate is not going to re-elect a Labor government until it demonstrates that it doesn't fuck up the economy.
Bob had made it through unscathed, but the nation was bitterly divided.
The times suited Bob Hawke. The Australian community was starting to get very disillusioned with politicians, with politics, with leaders. And Hawke was able to tap into this national mood.
What we see today is Malcolm Fraser in a police state, a very dangerous portent for the future.
Right throughout the 70s, he was known as a strong man, aggressive man, tough bloke, but at the end of the day, also a softer side which enabled him to be a conciliator and a man of consensus.
If I can achieve a result for the people I represent by negotiation with government rather than by strike action, that's the avenue I'll go down.
Bob's strategy of being a man of consensus worked across the board. While still a union man, mixing with the blue collars, he was also sitting on the board of the Reserve Bank and was mates with some of the country's richest tycoons.
I never took the view that they were all bastards. So I respected a lot of them, and that was reciprocated.
He could reach across the social divides of the country. He feels at home with working class people, but he can equally sit in a boardroom with corporate executives and talk their language.
I remember taking him to the El Rancho Hotel. I took him into the lounge bar. It was more dignified, if you like. And he said, what the fuck are we doing in here? And he said, no, where's the public bar? and he marched straight in. He held court for a couple of hours. They loved him. They just loved him, couldn't get enough of him. And to be fair, he couldn't get enough of them. He loved doing it. He really liked ordinary people and being with them.
Now, Australian women liked him very much, I have to say. I remember Mick Young saying one day that he'd been at the races with Bob, he said, "Oh, geez, the Sheilas, you couldn't get rid of them. They were just hanging around him," he said. "Young ones, old ones, fat ones, skinny ones, they just wouldn't let him alone."
And there's no question that the more outrageous he was, the more women liked him. You know, the larrikin in him was worshipped by men and women. There's no question. There was a phenomenon of the time. I'm not sure that it's been repeated.
As 70s Australia was playing fast and loose, our American cousins were keeping a close eye.
Can I have a bit of light?
Yeah. In secret cables, US diplomats reported not just on the state of the nation.
I understate my record, it was 11.5 seconds.
But on Bob's drinking habits.
Now, you've given me this assessment by the Americans. His record of 12 seconds for downing 2 pints of bitter. Now, let me say at the outset, you can see how much this is worth by the fact that I've understated my record. It was 11.5 seconds, and that's important. Anyway, let me start again. His record of 12 seconds for downing 2 pints of bitter, and it was 2.5 pints. I think I'll come back. It's just 2.5 pints, I think. All right. His record of 12 seconds for downing 2 pints of bitter toppled from Guinness Book of Records only this year. Hawke, in recent years, has sacrificed speed for distance in this field.
By the end of the 70s, the expectations on him were enormous. He was drinking way too much. People have been telling him for years he had to stop. He just wasn't listening. He didn't realise how destructive it was for him.
He was an alcoholic. It was nothing for him to have 20 beers in a day. He did some appalling things when drunk. I won't go into them. I never have, and I don't think it's appropriate to do so now. But some of the things were shocking, just plain bloody shocking. He was lucky that he went through an era where he couldn't be pinged. We didn't have the internet. We didn't have mobile phones. You know, let's face it, a Bob Hawke today behaving in the same manner would never become Prime Minister. He'd have been buried long before he got near the Parliament.
Even without social media, Hawke came close to self-destructing. At Labor's National Conference in July 1979, he drunkenly lashed out at the new leader of the party, Bill Hayden.
And Hawke just went to the bar and just exploded. And there would have been a dozen journalists within hearing range, and he didn't care. He just unleashed on Hayden.
I know it would be very nice for all of you to get Hawke to be coming out and making criticisms, and there you can say, here's an argument between Mr Hawke and Mr Hayden. I am not going to facilitate your earnest desires in that request.
You'll have to edit this, but I mean, this is when he called Hayden a lying cunt with a limited future.
Everything at Bob Hawke's Sandringham home was serene today, and only the family cats were in a mood for a fight.
Hey, Tex, come here. You silly little bugger.
Bob Hawke had hit rock bottom.
Well, he's beer drinking. He likes his beer.
Hey, it'd be all right if he gives up the booze.
I can't see Mr Hawke becoming Prime Minister.
Why not?
I don't think people will accept him.
To become the Prime Minister, he realised he had to deal with the greatest demon within him, and that was his drinking.
Under the very great pressures of the job that I have, I tend, I think, occasionally to take too much refuge in having a drink. And I think that's helped me, but on occasions I've taken that refuge too much.
I knew I had to change, and the major change, of course, was giving up the grog. I was not prepared to offer myself for leadership in a state where I could disgrace my country.
Someone once described him thus, and I quote, "He swears like a trooper, he works like a demon, he performs like a playboy, he talks like a truckie, and he acts like a politician." Ladies and gentlemen, Bob Hawke.
To the amazement of everyone around him, Bob went cold turkey.
If you're driven, and he was driven by ambition, he was born to be PM, he was determined to be PM, and so he could go from being an alcoholic one day to not drinking the next, just like that. And it was all because his ambition was greater than anything else in his life.
But how much of that description that I gave there, which is from the National Times, is true? We'll take it. Swears like a trooper? Oh, yeah. This one I'm not quite sure about. Performs like a playboy? I have my moments. Speaks like a truckie? Yeah. Not at the moment.
And I can say with absolute honesty that I never had a drop till 1993.
The monkey was off his back, and Bob was ready to make his next move, into Parliament. He took the safe Labor seat of Wills and joined the backbench. But as he'd always made clear, there was only one job he wanted.
Would you like to be Prime Minister?
It's not accurate to say that I would like to be, but I think what is accurate and honest is that if I went into the Parliament, I would aspire to the leadership. It wouldn't make much sense for me to think about just going in and being a backbencher in Parliament for the rest of my life, would it?
He came waltzing in, this show pony, expecting to take over, and there was really a great deal of animosity towards him.
He was obviously a very popular trade union figure, but he was widely mistrusted in the ALP. The Labor Party prized loyalty above all things. Bob was going to be loyal to Bob, and so there was that sense of him as potentially treacherous.
Gee, the centre left hated him. They really didn't like him. They didn't like the way he behaved because they were not of the mob. And they were a bit elitist in many ways, and Hawke didn't fit the criterion.
Hawke had to do one major thing. He had to nullify his negatives.
Bob would take the extraordinary step of using a tell-all biography to declare that his boozing and womanising days were over.
Blanche and Bob's decision to publish that biography when they did was again a high-risk procedure because Blanche did not leave out the less attractive aspects of Bob's behaviour. In fact, she described some of them in great detail.
There's a lot of it of which I'm not proud in my life. There's a lot of it of which I am very much. But I guess if people are going to have the opportunity of judging you, they should see it all.
When I published that biography, every single political journalist said, "This is ridiculous. This man will never be Prime Minister."
And his ratings went up 10% more. Because here's a person who did understand the character of Australia. So he understood people that actually like him more because he's a rascal, a larrikin, but he can be trusted.
The biography was tell-all in every way but one. It failed to disclose his affair with the author.
Your own words were that, in his own way, Bob remained faithful to Hazel. What did you mean by that?
Well, I mean that he's not a conventional man. That's a statement across the board. Within that context of not being conventional, he was very loving and he admires his wife a great deal.
You like him a lot, don't you?
Oh, yes, I like him tremendously. I admire him a great deal.
I tried not to let our relationship impact on the biography, because by the time I came to write it, we had been lovers, we'd broken up, and I'd stepped back from him. So I was very conscious of needing to be as objective as possible. There's no such thing as complete objectivity, of course, it's a myth. But I seriously was interested in finding out the truth about him for the public and also for myself in part, because he was this man I had been in love with.
I was aware that, of the relationship issues. I thought it was very sensible of Bob to, it would straighten out his affairs before he became Prime Minister.
And crucially, as a politician on the rise, Bob could present a united home front. Hazel would always stick by her husband and defend his shortcomings.
I mean, politics isn't an area in which even grey personalities survive. And I hope we're not painting too bleak a picture here. There have been a lot of very high, good, rich periods in our lives.
But it's been turbulent, and as I say, that's the very thing that...
It hasn't all been turbulent.
I pay tribute to Hazel. I was a pretty absent father, and she was both mother and father to my children, and she was always entirely supportive of me, even when I wasn't behaving myself as I well might have.
By now, Bob was a man on a mission. Within a year of coming into Parliament, he'd already challenged Bill Hayden for the leadership, but he jumped the gun.
He went over the top and the rest of us were still in the trenches without our boots on. We were still pulling on our boots and he declared war.
Within 90 minutes of the ballot, Mr Hayden set about repairing the damage he accepts the challenge caused the party.
Labor had remained loyal to Bill Hayden, while Bob had been reforming himself. Bill had been reforming the party.
Well, Bill Hayden, in my opinion, is one of the unluckiest, not tragic figure because he's not that sort of man, but when you think of him emerging as the person with the most credit out of the chaos of the Whitlam years, and they were chaotic, and there was a feeling in the Labor Party of immense disappointment of a squandered opportunity after waiting for so long, and they were all the emotions. Now, Hayden comes out of that, and he does rebuild the Labor Party's economic credibility.
Roll, thanks, tape, and take it.
Bill had brought Labor back from the dead and prepared it for government. But Bob's public appeal had made the party question itself. Did they have the right man to win the next election?
Hayden thought he'd romp home. In my informed view, that was not the case. It was my unhappy duty on more than one occasion to go to Bill Hayden and say, look, you're just not cutting it in terms of a leader. And in my view, unfortunately, I don't think you will.
Nobody willingly withdrew their support from Bill. It came down to an assessment of who is the most likely person to secure the next Labor government. Once all the lobbying and discussion started, it seemed that a shift to Bob was a sure thing.
Hawke's supporters had to convince Bill Hayden to resign. A public brawl for the leadership would damage both men and the party. They targeted Hayden's closest friend, the centre-left power broker, John Button.
It became an incredibly painful dilemma for my father. You know, Hawke was advancing. He didn't like Hawke at that time. I don't think many people in the party liked Bob. So Dad was faced with this incredible, painful decision. So he wrote him this letter. Dear Bill, you said to me that you could not stand down for a bastard like Bob Hawke. In my experience in the Labor Party, the fact that someone is a bastard of one kind or another has never been a disqualification for leadership of the party. It is a disability from which we all suffer in various degrees. On the other hand, I believe Hawke's leadership would give us a better chance of success. And the letter basically says, you are my friend, but ultimately my loyalty has to be to the ALP.
By writing to Bill and by persuading him in that way, he removed the last psychological support that Hayden had. If Button did not believe that he could win, if Button believed there should be a leadership change, I think that undermined Bill psychologically. So it was the critical intervention.
And I got Button in the end. When we beat Hayden, I spent a lot of time working on Button, and once we had Button, I knew we'd win. The centre had basically fallen in line, and they did.
The Labor Party's shadow cabinet in session in Brisbane late this afternoon, minus its two main characters, Bob Hawke and Bill Hayden. It had been a chaotic day, and in many ways a sad one too.
Inside the office behind me here, the Labor shadow cabinet is meeting. Bill Hayden is upstairs on the 12th floor.
It was terrible. It was terrible. Bob and Bill obviously had been crying. They were red-eyed. The others looked like they wished they were anywhere but there. And then Bill said, there's been a decision that Bob's going to stand for the leadership caucus next week, and I won't be the leader anymore.
A distressed Bill Hayden had disappeared, locking himself first in a room on the 12th floor of the Commonwealth Centre and then leaving the premises altogether.
People think of politics as a cynical game of, power and power hunger and so on, but there are deeply human emotional currents that run through this. And, just to watch Bill seeing his dreams just sort of crumble was, heart-wrenching.
And Bob was brutal, mate. Like, Bob was just so tough with Bill Hayden. I mean, I couldn't ever do it, but Bob was absolutely determined to knock him off, and he did.
I want to say this, I am not convinced that the Labor Party would not win under my leadership. I believe that a drover's dog could lead the Labor Party to victory.
I think that was a point at which the morality of the Labor Party was undermined. And I think that the philosophy which lay behind Hawke's decision, whatever it takes to win, triumphed at that point. And in a way, the Labor Party has suffered from that decay in its morality ever since.
Hawke was brilliant. In a Machiavellian way, pure genius.
But now to Brisbane and Mr. Bob Hawke. Mr. Hawke, could I ask you whether you feel a little embarrassed tonight at the blood that's on your hands?
You're not improving, are you? I thought you'd make a better start to the year than that. It's a ridiculous question. You know it's ridiculous. I have no blood on my hands. I was not involved in the discussions that Bill Hayden's fellow leaders had with him. I hope the standard of your questioning improves.
The reality was, because he did have blood on his hands, he mightn't have been the one wielding the knife, but he was well aware of where the knife was headed and could have stopped it at any time.
As it was, Bob's timing was blessed with one more stroke of luck. Just as Bill Hayden was falling on his sword in Brisbane, back in Canberra, the ever-opportunistic Malcolm Fraser had made a sudden dash to the Governor-General to request an early election.
And therefore, I've recommended to His Excellency that there should be a double dissolution of the Parliament. That has been agreed. The election will be on the 5th of March.
News was coming in and staff were running with news that Malcolm Fraser had gone to Yarralumla to try and call an election, believing that he would be running against Bill and have a good chance of success. So when we heard that he'd done that, but he got there too late because we'd already changed, well, we just went up, we cheered, we laughed, we thought, what? People were thrilled, not only thrilled at the outcome, but thrilled that Fraser had, made this shocking blunder.
He was wrong-footed. He thought he was going to be fighting Bill Hayden. He was fighting the most popular bloke in the country, which must upset your thinking a bit.
I would indicate that I will be a candidate for the leadership of the Labor Party.
Mr. Fraser, did you have any second thoughts this afternoon when you found out that you would like to face Mr. Hawke and not Mr. Hayden?
On the contrary, I had a little more relish. It'll be the first election in which two Labor leaders have been knocked off in one go.
The change in the electorate, once the announcement had been made, was extraordinary. It was amazing.
61% of those surveyed believed Bob Hawke would be a better leader than Malcolm Fraser.
From then on, wherever Hawke went, people were rushing up. Even more women were rushing up, hoping to kiss him.
And suddenly we had a leader who brought women to the party. And they voted for him in droves.
A national survey of 15 to 24-year-olds found that young people nominated Bob Hawke as one of their idols.
This great, almost mystical bond he had with the Australian people, that he'd go out there and people just wanted to touch the hem of his garment.
I don't think we've ever had a leader on either side of politics as at home with the mob as the early Bob Hawke. Bob knew them, he was of them, and he loved them. And I think that made him unique at the time, unique in Australian politics.
Today we set out together on a task much greater than winning an election, to bring Australians together in a united effort until victory is won.
There was the sense, you had it yourself, the party had it, everyone had it, we were heading to victory.
Bob would go into the 1983 election as the most popular candidate we'd ever seen. The Union man was ready to lead the nation.
The tragedy for politics today is that there are very few politicians that have had work experience.
Success, failure, fighting, persuading. It's a long, long apprenticeship.
Whether we can recreate those opportunities, it's very hard to see.
Well, Mr Hawke, Member of Parliament for 2 years and 4 months, Leader of the Parliamentary Labor Party for just 4 weeks.
I'd have to say that, you know, I just had the ideal preparation. Having had such a large public exposure in an important, powerful position and continuing close contact with the ordinary people of Australia, that's where my love was. Australian people are not fools. They know and they can sense when a politician's dinkum and when he's putting it on.
There was a landslide 24-seat swing to Labor, and Bob became our PM. But what would Bob Hawke bring to the top job? Now that we had a Larrikin in the lodge.
It's a day for all Australians, isn't it? It's a day that brings us all together. Marvellous.
Hawke was really prepared to share power, to share the glory.
Tonight, I can report that Australia is winning.
Suddenly economics was sexy.
If he was in the shower as Prime Minister, he just called you around. You took the good with the bad.
Bob Hawke is enjoying more popularity than any other Prime Minister in Australia's history.
Bob Hawke's above politics. Well, no, he isn't.
You don't have 7-week campaigns. Just 20 more days for something can go wrong. And it did.
We've had 5 Prime Ministers in 5 years, and that is the revolving door Prime Ministership.
There is no leadership. We don't trust any of them. We're sick of them all.
The politicians have just got pretty gutless all round.
Australians have never been so distrusting of politicians. But there was a time when things were different.
You'd be out of your cotton-picking mind if you didn't vote Labor. In 23 years, they had the opportunity to stop the take of the middleman. You tell me one thing that they did.
Ladies and gentlemen, Bob Hawke.
Bob was always a leader. A leader.
He had a sense of destiny.
Self-belief. Utter self-belief. His government produced modern Australia.
Bob Hawke was one of them, but he was also one of us.
How's that? Did any boss who sacks anyone for not turning up today is a bum.
I think people like to see a politician who's got a bit of character, a bit of individuality, and above all, a bit of humour.
I have my moments.
Now, Australian women liked him very much.
A Bob Hawke today, behaving in the same manner, would never become Prime Minister. He did some appalling things. Shocking, just plain bloody shocking.
Here's looking at you, kid.
We want flawed characters as our leaders that may have made some mistakes in the past, but they've learned from those mistakes.
You don't cease to be a husband. You don't cease to be a father.
So what made this flawed man a leader we'd never forget?
Leadership does consist of leading, of not saying, oh, what do the public think?
I regard Bob Hawke as the best Labor Prime Minister this country's had.
What is the future?
It's big.
This is what firemen have had to contend with all night.
In February 1983, Australia was in bad shape. Drought, bushfires and dust storms were mirrored by chaos on the political landscape.
Very hard to get the job. I feel there should be somebody do something about this.
Years of leadership changes, the dismissal and now the worst recession in 50 years had the nation disillusioned and divided.
Now is the time, if ever there was a time, for the people of Australia to rise in anger and start to intervene in the affairs of governing this country.
These were turbulent times, but out of them came a man the electorate thought it could trust.
The task and the challenge remain the same: to bring Australians together.
Bob Hawke was an Oxford scholar who'd become the trade union's main man and caught the nation's eye. An infamous larrikin who'd had to swear off the booze.
You can't be a drunkard Prime Minister. Womanising Prime Minister, frowned upon, but not as bad in the scheme of things. But one who was admitting his faults, one who's saying, look, I'm a flawed human being, OK, we'll cop that.
The man's popularity is unmatched. The ALP insists that appeal will translate into votes.
This great, almost mystical bond he had with the Australian people, that he'd go out there and people just wanted to touch the hem of his garment.
All I'm going to say now, you'll be a gawk if you don't vote for Hawke.
There was the sense, you had it yourself, the party had it, everyone had it, we were heading to victory.
Here he comes, victorious Bob Hawke, with his wife Hazel standing in the doorway, the happiest man in Australia.
Bob Hawke had triumphed on a wave of national expectation. He now had to deliver. Bob had swept to power promising to create jobs, provide access to education for all, and establish universal health care. But above all, he knew his government would live or die on how it managed the economy.
Mr. Hawke arrived early at Parliament House today with a lot of work to do.
Day one as PM. Instead of the $6 billion deficit he was expecting to inherit, it was in fact a whopping $9.6 billion.
No responsible incoming government can say, oh, well, there's another $3.6 billion that's been thrown at us, so that doesn't make any difference. Of course it makes a difference.
The realities of government set in pretty quickly. The fact that we were confronting a budget crisis was an important wake-up call very early on.
We inherited a significantly debilitated economy.
The Australian economy, when we came in, was in an absolute bloody mess. You know, we were going to finish up the poor white trash of Asia if we didn't do some tough things.
Bob reassessed every election promise except one.
The Labor government will return to the basic principle of the right of all Australians to health services according to their medical needs.
he would not abandon Medicare.
Very hard for people now to remember the days before Medicare. It literally was the case that for poorer people, sickness was not just a physical problem, but was a financial tragedy.
But with no money in the budget, Bob needed to find a way to fund universal health care. He would turn to his old trade union mates and ask them to take a wage cut to pay for it.
It's a very big call. We won the election, but we have to say to all those people, by the way, they're going to have a big reduction in real wages.
For Bob, it was a role reversal. As leader of the union movement in the 70s, he'd argued for big wage rises. Now, as Prime Minister, he was preaching restraint.
So I rang up all the union leaders and I argued the position. And it is one of the great negotiations in history, really.
These negotiations formed part of a series of groundbreaking deals known as the Accord, an agreement where the unions, led by Bill Kelty, would give up wage rises in exchange for benefits, like Medicare, which would become the defining social reform of the 1980s.
I say on behalf of the people that we represent, I think you truly are a great Prime Minister, and I think this is truly a great government.
Instead of the disputation of the 70s and the conflict, in the 80s the unions are effectively at the cabinet table. You know, Bill Kelty was often accused in the media of being, you know, the 20th cabinet minister or something.
The challenges are there to be met, and working together and with you, we will achieve those challenges in a way that no community, no society could have ever expected us to.
It wasn't just the unions who believed in Bob. Crucially, he also brought big business to the negotiating table.
It was the first time that guys who were CEOs of major companies had actually met trade unionists.
There was this great push to bring the institutions of power in Australia, business, the unions and government together. So everybody was in not necessarily furious agreement, but were, you know, discussing things in a civilised way.
He didn't think in terms of winners and losers. He thought in terms of what you needed to trade off and what I needed to trade off for us to come together.
By building this consensus, the Hawke government got the economy back on track, making it more internationally competitive while still looking after the workers.
This was the way the world was going, and Australia was on the right track, but we were not going to be a rotten low-wage society like America or a horrible Thatcherite sort of swamp like she was running.
Without a doubt, that period of the mid-80s, recognising the opportunity that the Accord provided for starting to get some wage restraint without people really hurting, was one of the really creative periods of policy making in Australia's post-war history.
Who painted this picture of a social democratic model that nobody else was adopting in the whole of the world? Nobody was saying this is what we should do. It was Hawke.
The Accord led to universal health care and one of the highest minimum wages in the world. But it also marked a watershed for the union movement.
I was opposed to it because I saw it as taking away from unions what most workers saw as the raison d'etre of unions, which is to fight for workers' wages. And to an extent, I've been, I think, proved right on that.
You know, when Hawke was ACTU president in the 70s, trade union membership was well over half of the workforce. Come forward to today and trade union membership is now less than 15%. But the benefit for Australian people has been absolutely immense. It is a key reason that we've had 26 years of uninterrupted growth since the early 1990s.
Bob helped set the framework for the Accord. But he'd let the unions negotiate the details with others, including his young and ambitious new treasurer, Paul Keating.
No Prime Minister could have asked for better, closer, more effective cooperation than I have enjoyed with Paul Keating. Thank you, Paul.
This was the essence of the Hawke leadership model. He knew how to share power with his ministers.
One of the secrets to Bob Hawke's longevity as Prime Minister was that he worked very well with the people immediately around him. In many respects, the most important relationship for a political leader is the relationship he or she has with the people immediately led. You can't do it all yourself.
Bob was lucky. Bill Hayden, the bloke he'd knocked off to become leader, had left him a great team.
I was extraordinarily fortunate in the quality of my cabinet. Got this collection of wonderfully talented people.
A fascinating group of people with fascinating collection of backgrounds, and young enough and enthusiastic enough to be able to chart a whole new course.
A cabinet that's drawn from places that they're never drawn from now. Button, the son of a Presbyterian minister, a lawyer. You have school teachers, doctors, Mick Young, the sheep shearer, and which gives it infinitely more, not only more breadth, but more depth and fire.
The surprise was how effectively Bob managed this diverse group of men and one woman.
Hawke ran it all meticulously. You couldn't just sit there thinking, oh, I don't want to get offside with so-and-so. If I say what I think about this, you'd say, Susan, what do you think about that? So you'd have to say it.
I think Hawke's temperament and his capacity to bring the best out of people was really ideally demonstrated in his relationship with Keating. I mean, Keating, it was a competitive relationship almost from get-go.
I want to allay any suspicions that the Treasurer has resigned. He's just running late.
Hawke was really prepared to share power, to share the glory, and it was an extraordinary complementary relationship.
In Paul Keating, Bob not only had a great treasurer, but an unrivalled political attack dog.
As you had, and as far as you're concerned, unless you're scripted, you're useless.
Order.
Unless you're scripted, you're useless.
Gilmore.
In fact, Mr. Speaker, it's an insult to one's professional skills to have to be in such a debate.
He loved the parliamentary theatre. I detested it. I was used to appearing in tribunals where your argument counted, but in Parliament it's just a bloody charade. But Paul revelled in it.
Together, Hawke and Keating would become one of the most effective political partnerships in Australian history.
Tonight, I can report that Australia is winning. Investment has begun to increase, especially in manufacturing. The wage moderation we have asked of Australian wage and salary earners during the past few years is working. We now have a competitive edge.
Subsequent governments, including Labor governments, have not attempted to model the Hawke leader, but lead by consensus, democratic approach. The fact that he had the confidence in us and allowed us to go and do our work meant that we rose to the occasion.
It didn't mean that he wasn't a leader. It's just meant that he was primus inter pares, first amongst many equals.
It's a great day for Australia. It's a great day for Australia.
The word that is often used to describe Bob is narcissistic. But a lot of narcissists in politics cannot share power. They're threatened by other people having the limelight. We're seeing that with Trump today. So it's the paradox of Bob in a way, is that he while having that absolute, self-love, and he was secure in himself.
Bob had the job he'd prepared for all his life, and he relished it. He had an extraordinary work ethic.
Hawke's leadership model was in many ways highly bureaucratic. Big emphasis on process. He was very well prepared. He was very much across his briefs.
Look, even when he lounged on the Lolo out in the lodge on a hot Canberra day in his bathers, showing off his marvellous physique, he'd be reading a cabinet submission. He was assiduous. The scene outside the swimming pool at the lodge was one that sticks in the memory because it's covered in oil and brown and showing his manhood as much as he could with a pair of budgies, thingamajigs on. Put Tony Abbott to shame.
He always liked to show as much of his flesh as he possibly could. If he was in the shower as Prime Minister, he'd just call you around and continue showering while he talked to you. But Hawke loved that. He fancied himself, so he liked to flash a bit of the flesh. But that was Bob. You took the good with the bad.
I'd got where I had very successfully, behaving as I did. The one big thing, of course, I changed was giving up the drink. But I wasn't going to change my persona or my presentation because that's what the Australian people obviously liked.
He loved horse racing, you know, every Friday afternoon. Form guides would be spread across the floor of the Prime Minister's office and they'd be going through what Bob used to call redistribution of income, redistribution from the bookies to me. Because he always won. You know, this guy was struck in the backside by a rainbow early in life.
Bob and his government were on a roll in their first term. The drought broke, the economy recovered. We even won the America's Cup.
Oh, look, it's just one of the greatest moments in Australian sporting history. And it's a day for all Australians, isn't it? It's a day that brings us all together. Marvellous.
Bob and his government were positioning Australia to compete on every stage. They embraced globalisation, floated the dollar, deregulated the banks, and dismantled market protection.
You didn't just have the sports report at the end of the news now, you had, you know, where the dollar was up to. Suddenly economics was sexy.
He was always going on about how the old government, the coalition, had their little narrow vested interests and they didn't want to look at what was happening overseas, whereas the Hawke government was opening the doors. We didn't want to protect industry, we wanted to be out there being the competitive nation that he thought that we were.
America, you look like you need a holiday, a fair income holiday. In the land of wonder, the land down under. Because every day's a good day in Australia.
G'day, Paul.
G'day, love.
He had a vision of self-reliant Australian nationalism, pride in a sense of being an Australian.
Australia's self-confidence was at an all-time high, and so was Bob's.
A lot of people say that in order to be a politician, one also needs to be part actor as well. Have you ever perhaps aspired to appear in a film?
Oh, well, frankly, Sigrid, I've been so busy with my TV work lately that...
Bob's approval rating was off the charts, at rock-star levels of 75%.
Bob Hawke is enjoying more popularity than any other Prime Minister, or for that matter, leader in Australia's history. And we thought we'd like to wish him a happy first birthday. He's waiting for us in our studio in Canberra. And Bob, good evening to you and welcome to the show.
G'day, Bert. Thanks very much. Thank you, Aaron. G'day, mate.
How are you, brother?
Good.
But even Bob's dream run couldn't last forever. The previous government had saddled him with a mid-term Senate election. Bob decided to use his popularity to bring both houses into sync. After just 18 months in the job, he called an early election in October 1984.
People didn't understand that. It didn't register with the public at all. And if he's so popular, what's he want to run an election for? And that's it. You know, what's he up to? This is this Australian scepticism.
To make matters worse, the normally astute Prime Minister made a poor captain's call. With his popularity soaring, Bob chose to run a 7-week campaign.
Despite all the activity here, it's a strange feeling, really, because here they are setting up for the opening of an election campaign that's already been running for 4 weeks.
Bob absolutely loved being out in the public.
And if there'd been a baby around today, Mr. Hawke might just have kissed it.
He loved election campaigning because it was an excuse to cut loose out of the office and get in amongst the mob.
We told him not to do the 7 weeks. I wasn't the only one, so I'm not going to say I told him. Everybody told him. But, you know, he knew best.
Prime Minister of Australia, Bob Hawke.
You don't have 7-week campaigns. Just 20 more days for something can go wrong. And it did.
At the start of the campaign, we had this cricket match against the bloody press gallery.
He hit the first ball for 4 runs and went on to hit 28 runs before this delivery. There was considerable concern about Mr Hawke's right eye, which was cut when the ball smashed the lens of his glasses. He was taken to the casualty ward of Royal Canberra Hospital.
Glass went into my eye, and the doctor said it had gone in another fraction, I would have lost the side of the eye.
At the same time, Bob was also grappling with a personal crisis.
I also had found out about my daughter, Rosalind, being a heroin addict, and those two things combined, so I just couldn't perform. It's impossible to, describe just how down I was.
You don't cease to be a husband. You don't cease to be a father. And my children and my wife have a right to be protected in this matter.
Luckily for Bob, he didn't just have a great professional team around him. He had Hazel. She was right by his side as the Prime Minister's wife, and the mob loved her too.
I think she, in many ways, she sort of quintessentially for the Australian woman was what Australian women saw themselves to be. She's terrific.
While Bob was floundering, Hazel came out swinging.
What were your feelings last week when you saw your husband suffer the way he did?
It was just something that put him off balance for the moment, but I've seen Bob in many situations. He's given his share and he's taken his share, and he's not only survived, but he's grown. It's one can't expect it all to be even and without taking a blow now and again. What matters is that you come back after the blow, and he always has.
Bob Hawke was re-elected, but his government suffered an unexpected swing against it.
When you go into an election, I guess there are 3 things that you want to do. First, of course, you want to win, which we've done. Secondly, you want to have a good workable majority. We've done that. And third, of course, you like to get as much icing on the cake as you possibly can. We'd hoped to get a bit more icing on the cake. We didn't do that. And that's something for next time.
Bob would never be Mr. 75% again.
Labor won, despite Bob Hawke, but they lost considerable skin in the process, and so did Bob Hawke personally. The electorate saw through it. This is being done for purely base political reasons. But Bob Hawke's above politics. Well, no, he isn't.
Say that you love me, say you respect me, say you'll protect me and re-elect me. It's gonna be all right.
When Bob looked in the mirror, I think he saw the entire Australian nation and everybody in it.
He's looking at you, kid.
And if they weren't adoring, then there was something to be done about that.
Bob was a touchy-feely. If there was nobody within touching distance, he would touch himself.
Well...
it's just checking that the earlobe was still in place. Conscious of the way the locks were going. I can remember having a long discussion with one of my peers. I said, how are we going to do Hawke? He's on our side. And he said Bob reminded him of nothing less than one of the American evangelists who was on Sunday morning television.
The really important thing is that we be able to sit down, the few of us that are left, we'll sit down collectively under the banyan tree with our crossed legs and say, we are pure.
So I got up on Sunday morning a couple of weeks in a row and watched The Hour of Power. It was perfect.
God hid a dream to me.
If you don't have a dream, probably because deep down in your heart, you're afraid you might drop it.
The Larrikin evangelist.
Do you love me? Yes! You love me a lot? Yes! Louder! Yes! No, I can't hear you.
It's impossible not to parody him in some way. So he really talked with his, with his eyebrows and his facial expression and his fingers and all this sort of stuff.
Lower real wage, sustaining record employment.
You could listen to him utter a 5-minute sentence and not have a clue where he began and where he finished. I always thought that you sort of applauded at the end for him getting out of this incredible tangle. He'd come through without missing a beat, as if it was sort of triumphant. What the hell did he just say?
But the constant showman, entrenched in popular culture, also held deeply fixed moral convictions. These would be publicly tested by his Liberal opponent, John Howard.
Mr. Howard, is the rate of Asian immigration into Australia too fast?
I think there are some people who believe it is.
What do you think?
I wouldn't like to see it greater.
Australia had had its notoriously racist White Australia policy until well into the 60s. Now, John Howard was suggesting that race should once again influence our immigration quotas.
There is some concern about the pace of change involved in the present level of Asian migration, and I think any government is entitled to take that into account.
Well, the great Asian immigration debate of 1988 was instigated by John Howard, not as an accident, not as a slip of the tongue, but a deliberate strategy. Bob Hawke was absolutely furious.
As a trade unionist, Bob had taken a strong stand against racism, and he wasn't going to back down now.
Mr. Howard can't have it both ways. He can't, 12 months ago, as does his leader in this state of New South Wales, stress a commitment to multiculturalism and then, sleazily, 12 months later, because he perceives there may be some advantage in some sectors of the Australian community, to walk away from it. It's both morally repugnant and it's economically insane. I will have no bar of it.
When we actually look at it in isolation, it didn't seem at the time, perhaps even to many people now, as being particularly radical, but it obviously was seen and was used as exhibiting some kind of bias against people on the basis of their race.
The policy would enable a future coalition government to vary the flow of people from any part of the world, and I emphasise any.
Once he'd said that, there was only one place to deal with, and that was in the Parliament. We'll debate this in the National House. We will debate where we stand in terms of immigration generally, Chinese immigration specifically. I will make this an incredible debate. He said, I'll knock the bastard over. I said, you will? He said, I'm sure I will. I'm sure I will. And I went home. I went home with an enormous sense of pride.
Good evening from Paul Murphy and welcome to PM, which comes to you tonight from the magnificent new $1 billion Parliament House in Canberra.
He saw that this was such a big moment. He said, mate, I just want you to come and sit in the advisor's box while I make this speech. And there I was, sitting in the new Parliament House, in what was really one of the most momentous times in modern history.
Let me make it clear, I do not accuse Mr. Howard of racism or of being a racist. Sadly, I make the more serious charge, I make the more damning indictment, the charge of cynical opportunism. In a cynical grab for voters, he has unleashed within his own coalition and within the wider community the most malevolent, the most hurtful, the most damaging, the most uncohesive forces. Far from one Australia, he has guaranteed a divided Australia.
Several of my colleagues crossed the floor. It was difficult. And I said later that I had not handled it very well. And I accepted that. It did me damage, and the Labor Party sought to exploit it by moving a resolution sort of declaring that race should never be a criteria, and that was obviously designed to split us.
Bob found racism abhorrent. And there's no question that Howard flirted with it. He got over it, but he flirted with it, and Hawke knocked him down. And I think that was one of the great things that Hawke did, because Australia's a better place because he did that.
No, you're on the record. You've already said that you would fight an election on this issue. Do you think that that's what you'll be doing?
That's the last thing I want, but I won't avoid the issue. If it's still there, I will take it on head on. Because of my belief in the fundamental decency of the Australian people, will win.
I just found it totally offensive in a moral sense personally. So I took no notice of those who said, look, go easy. It's not the sort of thing on which one goes easy.
Hawke's enthusiasm for Asia had been fuelled during his first visit to China in 1978.
And I was very fortunate because that 78 was the year that Deng Xiaoping made the single most important decision made by any political leader in the world in the 20th century. And that was to move the Chinese economy towards a market economy and open up to the outside world. That lifted hundreds of millions of Chinese out of poverty.
And created a huge new potential market.
He could get a sense of how significant Asia was going to be in Australia's future, and we couldn't go on looking to the traditional relationships with Europe. We had to, be much more, part of the region.
Hawke's awareness of China's significance was a key step towards it becoming our #1 trading partner.
Before he left Beijing, he strolled across Tiananmen Square to the Great Hall of the People for an historic signing ceremony marking China's biggest ever foreign investment.
There's $5 billion worth of iron ore lying in the dirt of China. Treasure house, Mr. Hugh declared today. We share it together, said Bob Hawke. China's appetite for iron ore is increasing rapidly under its modernisation program.
But just as things were taking off, Hawke would face one of the greatest tests of his career.
Columns of troops, many jacketless for their jog march from the city's outskirts, converged on Tiananmen Square. They were met by an estimated 1 million people.
Pro-democracy demonstrations erupted in Beijing.
Amazing as it may seem, people's power has turned back the People's Army for the second time in 2 weeks.
Thousands of student protesters occupied the city's main square in a tense standoff with Chinese authorities.
Tanks are rolling in down the main thoroughfare towards Tiananmen Square.
As the world watched, events would take a sickening turn.
The Beijing massacre. Unarmed civilians being gunned down by the People's Liberation Army.
We don't want the army, we don't want the gunshots in the fight. The army firing at the innocent people.
Freedom! Freedom! Democracy! Democracy!
In Australia, Chinese students also took to the streets. With one of our most important trading relationships on the line, Hawke would have to make a choice between playing it safe or speaking out.
The Australian ambassador in Beijing sent in a very descriptive cable about what happened at Tiananmen Square, including tanks rolling over people.
Hawke called for a public memorial at Parliament House that was televised across the nation.
The Prime Minister was determined to go into the Great Hall of Parliament and to take the cable with him. The office was concerned that he would become overly emotional, and they worked very hard at seeking to stop him doing it.
This is at once the saddest and the most compelling duty I've had to perform as Prime Minister.
Hawke was, I think, a pretty compassionate fella. Not genuinely compassionate, not politically compassionate, because even if it was going to hurt him, he still wore his heart in his sleeve.
Foot soldiers went through the square, bayoneting or shooting anybody who was still alive.
They had orders that nobody in the square be spared, and children and young girls were slaughtered as mercilessly as the many wounded soldiers from other units there. Anti-personnel carriers and tanks then ran backwards and forwards over the bodies of the slain until they were reduced to pulp, after which bulldozers moved in to push the remains into piles, which were then incinerated by troops with flamethrowers.
I've never really been embarrassed by it. Just as in Mamaka, tears do come to me somewhat more readily than they do to a lot of other people. That was me. It's part of the warts and all picture. It's heartbroken for China and for the Chinese people. Well, I can't talk about things like that without just putting myself there and seeing young people killed.
I call on the Chinese government to respect the will of its people. To crush the spirit and the body of youth is to crush the very future of China itself.
When I came off, this bureaucrat, I've forgotten who it was, said, "Prime Minister, you can't do that." I said, "I've done it. And that's the way it's going to be."
Bob Hawke had conviction, a set of beliefs that are right for the time and a set of beliefs that you will enact when you are in government. Conviction overrode polls. And that's the missing ingredient today.
Within days of his speech, Hawke would confirm that all Chinese students in Australia would have their visas extended to protect them against any possible reprisal. Chin Jin is one of those students.
All Chinese nationals, no matter they stayed in Australia, legally or illegally, will not be sent back to China against their own will. I started to think, okay, now, this country can be my country. I can stay.
What the response to Tiananmen Square did was to effectively double the number of Chinese born in Australia, and that effectively laid the platform for the size of the community today.
I think lots of Chinese people regard him just like a beloved father.
In many ways, when we think back on this was a bit of a watershed call. We talked the talk about our commitment to Asia and our willingness to see lots of Asian faces in our streets and our universities and everywhere else. But here it was actually doing it, and doing it in a way which was clearly going to have long-term repercussions.
4 years later, Bob Hawke went back to China.
I walked in, and as I walked in, Jiang Zemin got up, walked around to me, came and held out his hand. He said, "Mr. Hawke, there's one thing I want to say to you." And I thought, shit, what's this? And he said, "Mr. Hawke, China never forgets its friends, and we want you to know that we regard you as one of our best friends." So, you see, they'd understood that my heart had been broken for China and for the Chinese people.
Bob had followed his heart on racism and China, but he would follow the public when it came to the environment.
People probably forget now, but there were many, many people out on the streets of Australian cities and towns saying we need to better look after the natural environment. Hawke himself didn't have a particularly green bone in his body from an early stage. You know, he'd be out and about and people would tell him what they thought and he'd listen. He's a listener. You know, you can see that the Bob brain is sort of, you know, that's the way it works.
Hawke first took action in 1983 when he intervened to stop the Tasmanian government from damming the Franklin River.
If you look at the dam as a dam, it is at one and the same time an environmental obscenity and an economic absurdity. And it shouldn't proceed on either the grounds of environment or of economics.
This was an issue for Australia as a whole. It wasn't just an issue for Tasmania. It was resonating very strongly around the country.
He's the first leader in our time who actually basically just stepped out and said, I'm going to make a really strong action to protect the environment. You know, damn the consequences, that's what I'm going to do.
I think you only have to look around here, see the environment. To talk of mining in this area is just unacceptable.
Expanding Kakadu National Park and putting it on the World Heritage List. Protecting Shelburne Bay and the Daintree rainforests, protecting Jervis Bay. And Hawke essentially was prepared to face down state premiers. He was prepared to face down sections of the union movement in order to do these big, important saves on environment.
Now, fighting is not what most people like to do, to be honest. Even a lot of left people, they talk about it, don't actually like fighting. Bob liked fighting.
And Bob would go looking for a fight after being told about an international agreement his government was preparing to sign.
I said, Bob, there's a submission here that would have Australia sign up to a minerals convention that would allow mining in Antarctica.
Mining the Antarctic, they must be off their collective bloody heads.
Bob began his own 2-year crusade, lobbying world leaders to sign a very different agreement, one that would protect Antarctica from mining.
From the humble beginnings of a conversation on a Monday morning that said, well, come on, let's take this on, we can win this, and we did.
Like, I was young then, yeah, sure you'd heard a bit about Greenpeace and things like that, but here was an Australian Prime Minister putting a stake in the ground, and to be able to have the foresight that that needed to be done back then, when a lot of people were just looking at progress, 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 money, money, money. And that foresight has had a lot to do with where we're at the moment.
Hawke had delivered on the environment, but there were other Australians who were pinning their hopes on him.
I think in the 80s there was a great opportunity when Hawke had a lot of goodwill behind him, and giving back the land to Aboriginal people had reached an apogee, and he'd made some commitments.
The expectation was very high that there would be national land rights.
We should have actually initiated very early on, while it was right, while the opportunity was there, legislation enacted.
Hawke was prepared for resistance to his push for land rights from the Conservative state governments. But the fiercest opposition came from his own party, the Labor government in the West.
How many seats are in danger, do you think?
Well, that's really a case of guessing, but I would think somewhere between 3 and 5 seats could be imperilled by wrong decisions in this area.
Backed by the Western Australian Premier, Brian Burke, mining companies launched a scare campaign.
You think it's fair that less than 3% of our population should claim ownership of up to 50% of our land?
I remember the Burke government and its feral response to the notion of national land rights and to the notion of treaty. And it was racist. It was so racist and so scaremongering.
Through Aboriginal land claims, your right of access to up to 50% of Western Australia could be taken away.
You could just feel the venom and the ugliness of that campaign.
Burke and others got to him, bad, no votes in this, you're going to do enormous harm. Some of his richer mates got to him, and at the end, he didn't do what he should have done.
Burke is happy because on this very day, Hawke has publicly backed his policy that placates the captains of industry by denying Aborigines total control over their land.
There was one of those times where Hawke should have dug in his heels and said, no, mate, this needs to be done and I'm doing it.
Instead, Australia went into its bicentennial, a divided nation.
I think it has suddenly dawned on everybody we've got 200 years to celebrate.
200 years of white settlement saw some of the biggest protests the nation had ever seen.
The last time in the 60s when they had crowds this big, it forced the government to pull the troops out of Vietnam. Let's hope we can force Bob Hawke to do something about Aboriginal people this time round, hey?
Under pressure, Bob would make a new promise to Indigenous Australia.
There shall be a treaty negotiated between the Aboriginal people and the government on behalf of all the people of Australia.
The treaty would officially acknowledge the unique rights of all Indigenous Australians. But again, Hawke failed to follow through.
I don't know what the answer is on why a leader like Bob Hawke, who revolutionised this country for us in many ways, didn't take that step to deliver his promise.
In a sense, I look to you, my Aboriginal friends, asking you to say yes, you've done well, but also please understand the sense of disappointment in a way that I have, that more could not have been done.
He failed. He failed not because his heart wasn't in it, he failed because his heart wasn't in enough. That's the worst thing to do in life. If you don't believe in things, you don't do them, that's fine. But you actually believe in things and don't do them, that's sadness.
I guess in hindsight, perhaps I could have tried harder, but overall, I just content myself with the view that the pluses very much outweigh the minuses that undoubtedly are there.
Bob had become Prime Minister, promising to bring Australia together. He'd won a record 4 elections, and his government had rescued us from recession.
We've turned the economy around from deep recession to a rate of growth which is one of the fastest in the Western world.
But by 1991, the world economy was tanking. And after years of growth, Australia was in trouble.
The signs of recession are everywhere. Empty shops, to let signs.
We didn't really understand the effects of a sudden deregulation of the banking sector. The money poured out and a lot of it went into the wrong hands.
These were sort of Larrikin capitalists. A lot of really bad suits, ties, shoes, hairstyles.
We were all very naive and it ended up badly.
Many of these new tycoons had borrowed millions to build their empires. And as they went belly up, thousands of ordinary Australians lost jobs and life savings.
This is a recession that Australia had to have.
The fall has been so steep, the economy is now 0.7% behind its position 12 months ago.
If ever there was a time Bob's team needed to work together, it was now. Instead, his government would be torn apart by a power struggle between the PM and his heir apparent, Paul Keating.
We got distracted for a period, and that distraction was really, at the core of it, was Bob and Paul's relationship.
Bob had promised his ambitious treasurer he'd hand over the leadership after their 4th election. But when the time came, Bob reneged.
He said to me, and I remember the words exactly, he said, tell Paul that I want another 6 months. And I remember Keating looked at me and he said, fuck him. And that was That, as they say in the classics, it was on.
The battle is on. Hawke and Keating.
I've got a love affair with the people of this country. I just love being there as their Prime Minister, and I want to do it for quite a while yet.
Do you want his job, Mr. Pitt?
While he's still a very, very effective chairman, there was a sense that he inevitably lost a bit of the puff, and that, you know, Paul was entitled to have his place in the sun.
And Keating deserved an entry into the job that didn't have the poison. He warranted to be able to get the job without the blood. And it might have been hurting them, but I actually thought it was hurting the country more.
So here we are in the middle of a recession. 1 million people out of work. And yet, the federal politicians are locked in battle over a leadership challenge.
As the public suffered under a failing economy, Bob's fate was sealed.
Coming to you live from Parliament House, which has just seen easily the most dramatic day in its young history.
You've got to know when to go, and that's something that so many of them don't. It's the toughest transition, but it's ultimately human beings' weakest point.
Bob Hawke was never voted out by the Australian people. Instead, he became the first Labor Prime Minister to be kicked out by his own party.
But it's worth remembering, the guy was 72% when he became Prime Minister, was 27% when we booted him out. I tried to persuade him to go, and he wouldn't. Had he gone when I told him he should go, he'd have gone out the absolute hero. The absolute hero. But he wouldn't do that. And of course, you're not a hero when you get blasted out of office. It ain't the same.
How do you want to be remembered by the people?
I guess as a bloke who loved his country, still does, and loves Australians, and who was not essentially changed by high office.
His eventual defeating Caucus was a heartbreaking thing for him, and heartbreaking for many of us to observe too.
I hope they still will think of me as the Bob Hawke that they got to know, the Larrikin trade union leader who perhaps had sufficient common sense and intelligence to tone down his Larrikinism to some extent and behave in a way that a Prime Minister should if he's going to be a proper representative of his people, but who, in the end, is essentially a dinky-die Australian.
You're hurt, but I was not heartbroken, if I can put it that way. Hurt, but not heartbroken.
Bob's last job as PM would be to hand in his resignation to the Governor-General, Bill Hayden, the man he'd rolled to become leader 8 years earlier.
I had written a question I wanted to ask him, whether there was going to be something poignant about getting in the car and going off to Bill Hayden and Yarralumla. And somehow I couldn't get the question out. I could see that he was just holding it together. We're all so close. I could see Hazel's white knuckles, and I just felt it wasn't right.
Bob Hawke stepped down as Prime Minister on the 20th of December, 1991.
4 elections. That's amazing when you think about it, just plain amazing. And he was an extraordinary character, the like of which we hadn't seen before, and it looks like we won't see again.
He exuded something which I think was just authenticity. And I think if you're fair dinkum, people will listen to you and are attracted to you. But he was cheeky as well. And I found him to be the same, either on telly or on a one-to-one.
He wasn't just a steady-as-you-go Prime Minister. The job of running Australia is the hardest job there is. Bob did it extremely well for a very long time.
All right, this time we will sing. This one's for you.
That's all we'll sing.
Solid. I will lead you in solidarity forever. Yes, yes. I'm sad to be leaving, but looking forward to the future. Okay. Bye-bye.
Reforms in education, reforms in the healthcare system, reforms in family payments and social payments, reforms in taxation policy, industry policy associated. His government produced modern Australia. For good or ill, it's modern Australia.
What is the future?
It's big.
This bloke deserved to walk away with people applauding and clapping forever. And I know the clapping and applauding has come back, but when he left, he deserved the applause, he deserved the clapping, he deserved the cheers. He warranted that by being a great Prime Minister for a long period.
After more than 30 years in the public eye, Bob began a new life. He divorced Hazel and married his biographer. He also went back to having a beer and to being one of the mob.
There's an ex-Prime Minister of ours and a real favourite, loves his cricket, Bob Hawke.
It always happens at the cricket now, and I don't know, it's become a sort of friendly compact between me and the mob.
Each time they hear you talk, then you can remove the caucus and all bring to Bob Hawke. Remove the caucus, bring to Bob Hawke. The wonder of the down underdog, let's all bring to Bob Hawke.
Yeah, I'll go along with that.
The wonder of the down